Some places are best left alone, yet humans keep venturing where shadows hide and nature's secrets lurk. In this video, you'll witness 6 terrifying encounters with creatures so massive, intelligent, and deliberate that ordinary explanations fall apart. From a nightmarish lake attack in Tahoe that tossed kayaks like toys, to a massive figure assaulting a trucker's cabin in Montana, every scene leaves evidence of a presence far beyond human comprehension. On the evening of August 15, 2025, the air above Lake Tahoe carried a lingering warmth from the fading summer sun, tinging the sky with streaks of red and gold that reflected on the water's smooth surface. 4 friends, all experienced kayakers from the nearby Reno area, had decided on one last excursion before the cooler nights of fall set in. Brandon Hale, a 32-year-old outdoorsman with lean, wiry strength, led the small group, followed closely by his childhood friend, Mason Reed, a 29-year-old engineer with a penchant for water sports, along with siblings Laura and Derek Thompson, both in their late 20s and seasoned paddlers, accustomed to the lake's unpredictable shifts. The group's kayaks cut through the glassy surface almost effortlessly as they paddled away from the small cove near Sand Harbor, laughter and casual chatter fading into the rhythmic splash of paddles. As they ventured farther into the center of the lake, the surface began to change in subtle ways. Small ripples, first mistaken for the wake of distant boats, grew in unusual patterns around their kayaks, converging and swelling with an intensity that suggested something far heavier than wind or fish. Brandon paused, scanning the water, noticing that the ripples seemed to move against the current rather than with it, creating strange circular patterns around their vessels. Mason frowned, a sinking feeling taking root, while Laura gripped the paddle tighter, and Derek, ever the skeptic, tried to joke it off, though his voice carried a nervous edge. The light from the setting sun refracted off the water in sharp lines, revealing a shadow below the surface that did not belong, elongated and misshapen, sliding beneath the kayaks with an unnatural grace. The first sound came suddenly, erupting from beneath the calm with a feral intensity. A guttural, chest-rattling roar that bounced off the granite cliffs lining the lake, causing birds to flee from the trees along the shore and sending shivers through the group. Brandon's heart pounded, his instincts screaming that this was no ordinary animal or mechanical disturbance. Before anyone could react, a violent upward thrust slammed into Mason's kayak from below, tipping him into the cold, sudden depths of Lake Tahoe with a splash that seemed to echo for miles. The water closed over his head, and panic took him for a heartbeat until Brandon and Derek lunged to grab the edge of the kayak, pulling him free. Their relief was brief. The other kayaks rocked violently, shoved by a force that pressed against them from beneath with terrifying strength, each impact throwing the paddlers off balance and leaving them fighting to maintain control. The lake, once serene and placid, had become a restless, unpredictable threat. It was then, as they clawed at their paddles and braced against the sudden surges, that they caught sight of it. Along a jagged section of the shoreline, where boulders rose like jagged teeth from the water, a figure emerged from the shallow waves. It stood motionless, waist-deep, silhouetted against the dying light. The shape was immense, far larger than any human or known bear, with shoulders broad and arms hanging heavy at its sides, the outline unmistakably upright. The kayakers froze, their muscles locked in shock and disbelief, hearts hammering as their minds tried to process the impossibility of what they saw. The figure did not move, did not roar again. It simply watched, towering above the waterline, exuding a presence that seemed to press against the air itself. Time stretched in the tension, the silence of the lake becoming almost deafening in contrast to the earlier chaos. The attacks ceased as suddenly as they began. The ripples subsided, leaving only gentle waves that lapped against the kayaks with a deceiving calm. Brandon led the group toward shore cautiously, muscles tense, eyes constantly scanning the shoreline for any movement, but the figure had vanished as silently as it had appeared. Their arrival at the small, rocky beach brought no relief. Each kayak bore long, splintering gouges along the hulls, deep scratches that resembled massive claw marks, far beyond the reach of any known animal in the region. The wood and fiberglass were shredded in places, jagged edges protruding where the force had struck. They dragged the kayaks onto the sand, examining them with disbelief, each mark a mute testament to the power that had struck from beneath the surface. Derek muttered under his breath that it must have been submerged logs or debris, but even he could not hide the unease in his tone. By the time the group had secured the kayaks, twilight had descended fully over the lake, painting the water a dark, reflective black that mirrored the jagged peaks around them. No other boats were in sight, and no evidence of the disturbance remained beyond the damaged kayaks and the echo of that terrifying roar, which seemed to linger in their minds long after the sound had faded. When they recounted the event to local authorities, officials offered the standard explanation: shifting logs, underwater debris, perhaps a sudden upwelling or unusual currents caused by the late summer warmth. Yet the locals, those who had grown up along the shores of Lake Tahoe and who knew its moods better than any visitor could, whispered of the lake's own guardian, an enormous presence that patrolled its waters and cliffs, one that did not welcome intruders. Tales of fishermen disappearing overnight, hikers hearing strange roars echoing from the cliffs, and the occasional sighting of enormous footprints along the sandy edges were woven into the collective memory of the region, dismissed by outsiders as legend or exaggeration, but never entirely forgotten. For Brandon, Mason, Laura, and Derek, the night left a mark deeper than the scratches on their kayaks. The memory of that towering figure, the guttural roar, the sudden chaos of their overturned boat and plunging friend remained etched in their minds with a clarity that neither time nor rational explanation could erase. Sleep eluded them for nights afterward, their dreams haunted by rippling water and shadowed shapes, the feeling of being watched by something vast and unknowable pressing into their chest, even in their own homes. Late in the night on September 12, 2023, the highway stretching through the remote forests of western Montana was cloaked in a dense, clinging fog, the kind that seemed to swallow headlights and muffled even the sound of tires against asphalt. Jim Lawson, a veteran trucker of 34 years with countless miles behind him, had parked his 18-wheeler along a rarely used pull-off, seeking a short rest after a long haul from Billings. The interior of the cab smelled faintly of coffee and engine oil, maps and tools scattered across the dashboard where he had been planning the next leg of his route. The quiet was almost total, broken only by the low hum of the idling engine and the occasional whisper of wind through the pine trees lining the highway, until a sudden heavy thud reverberated across the roof, vibrating through the metal frame of the truck with shocking intensity. Startled, Jim sat upright, eyes straining through the fog-streaked windshield, expecting perhaps a falling branch or some wayward wildlife, but the next sound was worse, a crushing impact against the driver's side door that bent the metal with an almost inhuman force, the reverberation jolting him in the seat and scattering papers and loose tools across the cab. The interior lights flickered violently, plunging the space into brief, disorienting darkness, only to return with a harsh glare that revealed what he could not fully comprehend at first. Across the windshield, a massive shadow loomed, upright, broader than any human, its form deliberate and unnervingly intelligent, pressing against the glass as though weighing the cab, testing the boundaries of his presence. Jim's heart raced, every instinct screaming that this was not any ordinary animal, The shadow shifted with a subtle, terrifying grace, moving atop the truck roof with a weight and coordination that seemed impossible, even for the largest bears known to the region. A sudden slam against the steering wheel sent maps, tools, and his notes flying across the seat in a chaotic storm of paper and metal, as if the intruder were studying the cab's interior with a curious, almost methodical interest. Jim's body tensed, frozen for a heartbeat, the fog outside turning the world into a white, wavering void in which the figure moved with an eerie silence despite the destruction it caused. When he finally managed to react, fumbling for the ignition, the figure crouched over the seat, its massive arms spanning the gap between dashboard and ceiling, the impression of sheer muscle and bulk pressing down as though it were assessing him, measuring the threat, or perhaps considering the possibility of curiosity. Jim's hands shook violently as he turned the key, the engine groaning awake under the stress of his panic. As the vibrations of the truck filled the cab, the figure leapt backward with a sudden force, leaving a series of enormous, deep impressions across the roof and side panels that dented and bent the metal beyond the capability of any ordinary creature. Its retreat was deliberate, calculated, and for a fleeting moment, Jim could see the outline of enormous shoulders and long limbs before the fog swallowed it once more. He did not wait a second longer. Heart hammering, he eased the truck into motion, the fog swirling around the headlights in shifting clouds, and drove several miles before daring to glance back. The darkness beyond the beams of light offered no hint of movement, yet every nerve in his body insisted that whatever had pressed itself against the cab remained close, watching from the trees and shadows along the road. When he finally reached the nearest town hours later, still trembling and soaked with sweat from the shock, authorities were called to inspect the scene. The cab told its own story. Metal panels bore the weight of enormous force, dented and splintered in ways that suggested blows far heavier than anything known to roam Montana's forests. Steering controls were smashed and rearranged. Items inside the cab were tossed or pressed into unnatural positions. Tools were jammed beneath seats, and papers were torn and scattered. Muddy footprints, far too large and wide to belong to any human or known animal, marked the roof and sides of the truck, pressed into the surface with such weight that even the paint had scraped away along the edges. Forensic teams examined the interior and exterior meticulously, noting the precision of the damage and the unusual distribution of weight. They could not account for the intelligence implied by the movement, the methodical exploration of the cab, or the fact that nothing had been stolen or damaged beyond the deliberate manipulation of the environment. Jim remained at the scene for hours afterward, a witness caught between disbelief and stark terror, replaying each detail of the attack in his mind with agonizing clarity. The figure had not acted like any bear or wild animal he had encountered on countless drives through Montana. Its movements showed intelligence, a careful assessment, and a strength far beyond that of the region's known predators. Authorities offered no firm explanation, citing high winds, falling branches, or perhaps a huge bear, but none of these explanations could reconcile the evidence, the sheer weight implied by the impressions, the arrangement of tools and papers inside the cab, and the deliberate, almost investigative nature of the figure's movements. Jim, along with a few local truckers who had long shared stories of strange occurrences along the Montana highways, whispered that something else was at work here, something massive, cunning, and unseen by science. While the official reports remained cautious, the local lore described a creature that roamed the forests and remote stretches of road, upright, intelligent, and far larger than any known animal, a guardian of the wilderness that occasionally ventured into human spaces with unsettling purpose. For Jim, the memory of that night remained vivid long after the fog had lifted and the truck had been repaired. He returned to his routes with heightened vigilance, every rustle of the trees, every shadow along the highway, carrying the potential of the unseen presence he had encountered. On the night of January 17, 2019, the Siberian taiga lay under a heavy blanket of darkness, the sky without moon or stars, and the wind carried a biting cold that cut through every layer of clothing and bone alike. Officer Sergei Petrov, a seasoned forest ranger and law enforcement officer with nearly 15 years patrolling the remote expanses near Krasnoyarsk, moved cautiously along a narrow, snow-covered trail, the thick pines looming like ancient sentinels overhead. His boots crunched against the frozen undergrowth, and the beam of his flashlight cut through the blackness in a trembling arc, illuminating the skeletal trunks and fallen branches coated in frost. He had been dispatched to investigate a missing hunter report, an experienced man who had failed to return from a solo excursion into the dense northern forest. The deeper Petrov ventured, the more the forest seemed alive in ways that defied reason. A low, almost human-like growl rolled across the snow-laden branches, carried by the gusting wind, freezing him mid-step, as if the temperature itself had dropped another 10 degrees in an instant. He paused, flashlight scanning the shadowed trees, heart pounding, every sense sharpened by a mixture of professional caution and instinctive fear. There was no sign of the hunter yet, but the sounds of the night seemed to move with deliberate purpose, shifting through the trunks and underbrush in ways no ordinary predator could replicate. The crunch of his boots sounded deafening in the absolute silence that followed, each step a measured negotiation with the oppressive ancient woods. Petrov stumbled suddenly over a mound of frozen snow, and the light fell upon a sight that stole the warmth from his body. The hunter's form slumped against the massive trunk of a pine, the snow crusted across his shoulders and arms, but his body otherwise untouched. No blood, no torn clothing, no sign of a struggle. The rifle lay at his side, and the pack was stacked neatly atop one another, as if someone, or something, had taken care to arrange them in precise order. Circling the body were enormous footprints, wider and longer than any human's, pressed deeply into the snow in tight, deliberate arcs. The impressions radiated power and intention, yet carried no hint of haste or panic, fading into the forest as though the visitor had stepped lightly despite its size. Petrov's breath formed clouds in the frigid air, but he could feel the oppressive gaze of something unseen pressing against his mind, a cold, calculating intelligence that watched and waited from the shadows. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying the sound of movement between the trees that was too fast and precise to be attributed to wind or smaller animals. Shadows flickered unnaturally, stretching and contracting across the snow, vanishing before they could be fully perceived. Petrov's hand instinctively went to the sidearm at his hip. However, the rational part of him knew that no firearm would likely deter the presence he felt, pressing against the edge of awareness, something massive, patient, and intelligent enough to observe without exposing itself fully. The temperature seemed to drop again, frost forming instantly on his eyelashes and beard, the kind of unnatural cold that made every inhale a white, biting cloud. It was as though the forest itself had become sentient, bending the air and snow to its will, cloaking its predator in a shroud of icy dread. Petrov examined the hunter's body carefully, noting the absence of injury, the impossibility of a natural explanation. The way the rifle and pack were stacked suggested intention, as if the hunter had been both spared and marked. Each footprint around the scene was a message in itself, symbols of enormous power and precision, leaving a narrative that no human mind could fully comprehend. He moved cautiously, trying not to disturb the delicate traces, aware that any sudden motion might trigger a reaction from whatever had left them. Each breath seemed louder in the stillness, each crunch of snow under his boots, an echo that might reveal his presence to an unseen observer. Minutes stretched into hours, though Petrov could not be certain of the passage of time. The deeper he scanned the surrounding forest, the more he felt the pervasive sense of being watched, studied, his movements traced by unseen eyes that knew the terrain intimately and anticipated his every step. The tight arcs of the footprints suggested a creature capable of balance and strength beyond known wildlife, a predator both careful and deliberate, one that left victims alive in the sense of preservation, yet immobilized in ways that communicated its dominance. The hunter's stillness, the precise arrangement of belongings, and the ghostly patterns in the snow were a warning and a demonstration of power, a language without words that spoke of supremacy over the human presence in its territory. Petrov's instincts screamed at him to leave, to retreat from the unnatural pressure pressing at the edges of his perception. He moved backwards slowly, flashlight sweeping the trees, revealing glimpses of shapes that might have been branches or shadows, moving too fluidly and too quickly to belong to anything ordinary. Every so often, the growl returned, low and resonant, vibrating through the air in a manner that seemed almost sentient, attuned to his position and reactions. The forest had become a labyrinth of silent intelligence, with each tree and snowdrift a possible tool for observation or concealment. The hunter's fate, though physically intact, left a mental scar, an example of a predator that did not need violence to demonstrate control, a presence capable of bending the environment and human comprehension to its will. By the time Petrov managed to leave the scene, the forest seemed to exhale behind him, the growls fading into the distance, yet leaving an indelible impression of something vast and cunning lingering among the trees. He returned to the small village near the edge of the taiga, shaken to the core, his professional mind wrestling with evidence and instinct, each conflicting with the other. Locals whispered of enormous, upright creatures that roamed the northern forests, creatures both intelligent and territorial, leaving their marks and messages in snow and shadow, glimpsed only by those unlucky or brave enough to wander into their domain. Petrov could not deny what he had seen, the footprints and precise arrangement of the hunter's belongings, or the sense of cold observation that had pressed down upon him. On the morning of September 5th, 2022, the Johnson family awoke to a cold, damp dawn over their rural Vermont farm, the sky a pale gray that pressed heavily over the rolling hills and scattered maple and apple trees lining their property. For generations, the Johnsons had farmed this land, tending apple orchards that stretched across gentle slopes and small valleys, a labor of patience and care that bore fruit both literal and symbolic of a family's hard work. That morning, however, the calm rhythm of harvest season was shattered. As Thomas Johnson, the patriarch, stepped outside with a coffee mug still warm in his hands, he froze at the sight before him. Entire rows of apple trees had been stripped bare, the ripest fruit gone overnight, as if an invisible hand had passed through, plucking each apple with unnerving precision. The damage extended beyond the loss of fruit. Heavy branches, some more than 3 inches thick, lay snapped across the ground, gouged into the soil with a force that betrayed immense strength. The barn doors, once securely locked the night before, were now standing wide open, yet the locks remained unbroken, no sign of tampering or forced entry. The family's dogs, usually alert and aggressive toward any intruder, had refused to leave their kennels, whining and trembling as though sensing a presence far more imposing than any human trespasser. The wind carried faint traces of movement, a disturbed scent that clung to the air like an invisible warning, chilling the family as they slowly ventured into the orchard to survey the scene. Beneath the pale light of dawn, they discovered footprints that made every instinct in Thomas and his children tighten with unease. The impressions were enormous, barefoot, far too wide to belong to any human, pressed deeply into the soft soil and circling the orchard with deliberate, careful arcs. The pattern of movement suggested more than mere passage. It was as though the intruder had inspected the property, studying its layout, noting the positions of trees and structures, leaving a message in the ground that was both clear and incomprehensible. Every step radiated weight and intelligence, yet there was no sense of panic or haste. The footprints led back toward the forest at the edge of the orchard, disappearing beneath the canopy as if they had been swallowed by the trees themselves. Closer to the forest, the Johnsons found another, stranger sight. Baskets of apples neatly stacked, filled to the brim, arranged in orderly rows at the tree line, untouched and almost ceremonious in their presentation. It was impossible to determine whether the intruder had placed them there as a gesture, a mockery, or simply a practical action before carrying the remainder away. The symmetry of the stack, along with their deliberate placement at the forest's edge, conveyed an intelligence and awareness beyond that of any animal known to the region. The family had lived alongside bears, foxes, and deer for decades, yet none behaved in such a manner. Bears, powerful as they could be, did not walk in deliberate arc, did not arrange fruit neatly, and did not leave a palpable sense of being studied, observed, and measured. Laura Johnson, the eldest child at 19, knelt to examine the footprints more closely, noting the depth and the shape of the toes. The impressions were elongated, with wide heels and prominent arches, pressed deep into the soil, as if every step bore the weight of a fully grown human, scaled up several times. The spacing between footprints suggested a gait both fluid and efficient, a stride that could cover vast distances with minimal effort. Thomas observed that while the apple theft had been extensive, the damage to the trees and property seemed selective. The force applied only where necessary to remove the fruit, avoid injury to structural support, and leave clear signs of presence. Every detail suggested an intelligence capable of observation, decision-making, and subtle planning. The family moved cautiously through the orchard, eyes scanning the dark edges of the forest, where shadows twisted unnaturally between trunks and undergrowth. A faint rustling carried from the tree line, though no animal emerged. No bear, deer, or human intruder revealed itself. Even the dogs remained at the edge of the kennel line, unwilling to cross, ears flat against their heads, emitting low whines that underscored the tension permeating the morning. Every instinct screamed that the orchard had been visited by a force far beyond the ordinary, a presence capable of moving unseen and operating with a patient, deliberate intelligence that made the Johnsons' lifelong understanding of wildlife seem inadequate in comparison. Neighbors, arriving later to inspect the scene, offered explanations steeped in caution and practicality. Bears, perhaps, or a late-night prank by local teenagers. But the Johnsons knew their land too well. Bears did not leave carefully arranged stacks of fruit, nor did they trace measured arcs around property, studying each tree and structure with evident purpose. The sense of being watched lingered even hours later, a weight pressing on the edges of perception, as if the observer had vanished but retained an awareness of the family's movement, capable of tracking them from the shadows unseen. The orchard felt altered, a place transformed from familiar landscape to a stage for something beyond human comprehension. By midday, the family had recovered some of the stolen apples, though much had been taken, leaving gaps in the rows and twisted branches as evidence of immense strength. Even as they worked to repair the orchard, clean up fallen limbs, and re-secure the barn doors, a quiet tension persisted. The wind whispered through the remaining trees, carrying faint echoes of movement in patterns that suggested more than natural rustling. The Johnsons could not shake the impression that the orchard had been observed deliberately, examined, and judged, that the presence responsible had operated on terms completely foreign to human logic, leaving behind a tableau of destruction and order intertwined. That night, long after the sun dipped below the horizon, Thomas lay awake in the farmhouse, listening to the trees and the rustling of wind against the roof. The memory of enormous footprint, the snapped branches, and the neatly stacked basket didn't allow him to sleep. He imagined the intruder moving silently among the trees, capable of observing without revealing itself, aware of every step and every glance from those who had entered its domain. The orchard, once a source of pride and routine, now seemed haunted by intelligence too vast and deliberate to be dismissed. The Johnsons understood, with an uneasy certainty, that the world they thought they knew, the rhythms of wildlife, the predictable behaviors of forest creatures, was only a fragment of what existed in the shadow, along the edges of the familiar. On the morning of July 14, 2018, a thin layer of fog clung to the jagged ridges of Long's Peak in Colorado, the early sun struggling to penetrate the mist and illuminate the narrow paths and steep cliffs that had challenged climbers for generations. A three-person climbing team, experienced and well-equipped, had been on a week-long expedition to navigate a particularly treacherous section of the mountain's east face, where narrow ledges and hidden ravines tested both endurance and skill. The team consisted of Lucas Brenner, a 36-year-old guide and mountaineer known for his meticulous planning, Naomi Castillo, a 29-year-old climber with several solo ascents across the Rockies, and Elliot Hayes, a 31-year-old engineer whose obsession with peak bagging had led him to some of the most dangerous climbs in the region. Their expedition had been routine until reports came in that they had failed to check in after the third day, prompting search teams to begin combing the high-altitude terrain. The first sign of their presence came when rescuers discovered the ridgeside campsite, abandoned and eerily silent. Tents lay shredded or collapsed, ropes cut cleanly as if severed with purpose, and scattered climbing gear littered the rocky ground. Items that should have been carefully stowed, packs, harnesses, carabiners, were thrown in disorderly heap, but upon closer inspection, the stacks suggested intention rather than chaos. Helmets were balanced atop backpack, ropes coiled in deliberate patterns, and tools arranged in small clusters along flat rock surfaces, as if someone had handled them with care before leaving. The wind whistled through the ridges, carrying with it the scent of cold stone and snowmelt, but no other human footprints marked the surrounding snow or scree. Approximately half a mile down the slope, searchers discovered the body of Lucas Brenner, slumped upright against a boulder in a narrow gully, his eyes wide in a frozen expression of terror. There were no visible wounds, no signs of a fall or struggle, yet the body's positioning indicated a sudden, unnatural stop, as though he had been forced or compelled to remain there. Snow clung to his jacket and pants, and small rock fragments pressed into the clothing suggested a brief, violent descent, though investigators could find no logical path for the trajectory. Near the body, enormous footprints trailed into a hidden ravine, each step leaving deep impressions in loose scree, clearly belonging to a creature far larger than any human or known wildlife. The spacing and depth of the prints suggested immense weight, but the careful placement indicated balance and intelligence, not the uncontrolled slide of a rockfall or avalanche. Search teams combed the surrounding area, finding no additional footprints, no signs of other bodies, and no evidence of an accident. Elliot and Naomi remained missing, and the scene offered few clues beyond the strange arrangement of gear and the singular body of their colleague. The prints leading into the ravine vanished suddenly beneath a rock overhang, leaving rescuers with the chilling impression that the creature responsible could move silently and with intent, disappearing into the mountain as easily as shadows shifted with the sun. The cliff walls and jagged outcroppings seemed to funnel sound in unnatural ways, carrying every scrape of climbing gear, every distant footfall, in echoes that warped perception and heightened the sense of presence. Investigators chalked the incident up to a fall or a misstep, suggesting that one climber had lost control and inadvertently caused a cascade of events that led to the disappearance of two teammates. Yet no evidence supported this theory. The careful stacking of equipment, the absence of natural avalanche or rockfall triggers, and the enormous footprints that could not belong to any known animal defied conventional explanation. Local climbers whispered among themselves of a shadowy, towering presence that haunted these high reaches of the Rockies, appearing suddenly, moving with purpose, and leaving subtle but unmistakable traces of intelligence. Some said the mountains themselves were alive in a sense, with something unseen observing, calculating, and deciding who might vanish next. The ravine where the footprints disappeared offered little indication of what lay beyond. It was narrow, dark, and treacherous, with jagged rock walls and hidden ledges that seemed impossible to navigate even for the most skilled climber. Yet the depth of the impressions suggested that being responsible could traverse it with ease, moving through loose scree and unstable surfaces without dislodging rocks in a pattern consistent with standard physics. It had visited the campsite, manipulated equipment, moved a human body, and disappeared without leaving a trace that could be analyzed using conventional forensic techniques. Every detail implied both immense strength and an intelligence capable of understanding human behavior, spatial relationship, and the practical aspects of climbing gear. For those who discovered the scene, the impression was suffocating. The mountains, usually a place of challenge and exhilaration, felt altered, imbued with an unseen sentience that operated in silence, unseen but omnipresent. Helicopters and ground teams scoured the nearby cliffs, scanning for any sign of Elliot or Naomi. Yet, the only evidence remaining was the disordered campsite, the single body, and the footprints that vanished into darkness. The investigators' reports emphasized the lack of clues, the impossibility of a fall or natural accident, and the strange arrangement of objects that suggested deliberate manipulation. Yet, official conclusions avoided speculation, leaving room for the murmurs of locals and climbers who spoke in hushed tones of a presence that defied explanation. By the time the sun fully rose, washing the peaks with golden light, the ridge had returned to a deceptive calm. The fog lifted, the wind softened, and the mountain appeared as serene and majestic as it always had, betraying no hint of the events from the previous night. But the memory lingered in those who had seen it. The stacked gear, the enormous footprints, the upright body frozen against the boulder, and the eerie sense of being watched by a presence that could move through stone and shadow with purpose and discretion. Mountaineers who had frequented Long's Peak spoke of the ridge in new terms afterward, cautious of its shadows, aware that unseen eyes might linger along narrow ledges, observing, calculating, and waiting. Even years later, climbers who traced the route where the team had vanished recounted the same unease, a feeling that something immense and intelligent could appear at any moment. And though Elliot and Naomi were never found, their disappearance, alongside the single body and the signs of deliberate intelligence, left a haunting certainty that Long's Peak harbored a presence far beyond human comprehension, silent, immense, and unyieldingly patient. On the morning of June 18, 2024, the shores of Okanagan Lake were cloaked in pre-dawn stillness, the water smooth as glass and tinted in faint shades of indigo beneath a sky just beginning to lighten. Carl Henderson, a 42-year-old fisherman with years of solitary lake trips behind him, had arrived the evening before, eager to camp at the water's edge and enjoy the quiet hours before sunrise. His small aluminum boat, weathered but sturdy, rested on the rock, fishing rods and tackle neatly packed in the gear bags he had arranged around a modest fire pit. Carl had always preferred solitude, trusting his instincts and knowledge of the lake to guide him toward the best spot. Yet, nothing in his experience could have prepared him for the events that would unfold before the sun ever appeared above the distant hills. He was roused abruptly from sleep by a gut-wrenching thud, the sound carrying through the stillness with such force that the ground beneath him seemed to tremble. Heart pounding, Carl leapt from his sleeping bag, stumbling toward the shoreline with a mixture of instinctive fear and urgent curiosity. The sight that greeted him froze him in place, rooted to the damp sand. His small aluminum boat lay shattered across the jagged rock, its hull gouged with deep scratches, bent and twisted as if a force far greater than human strength had torn it apart. Fishing rods and tackle, which moments before had been scattered in preparation for the day, were now stacked unnaturally atop one another, arranged in deliberate order as though an unseen hand had taken care to manipulate them into place. The scene radiated a tension that went beyond destruction. It suggested observation, intention, and a knowledge of Carl's actions that no ordinary animal or person could possess. Around the campsite, massive footprints pressed into the wet sand, each impression broad and elongated, far larger than any human foot. They circled the area in slow, measured arcs, tracing patterns that hinted at intelligence rather than mere curiosity or random movement. The prints led from the water's edge into the dense tree line, disappearing among the shadows of pines and undergrowth, leaving no other trace beyond the impression of weight and deliberate pacing. Carl's pulse quickened as he realized that whatever had moved through the area had not only possessed extraordinary size and strength, but had operated with caution and awareness, observing the layout of his campsite, manipulating objects, and leaving behind evidence of deliberate study rather than chaotic destruction. A low, guttural growl rolled across the water, vibrating through the still morning air in a cadence that felt almost human, almost conversational in its rhythm. The sound echoed off the distant hills and cliffs surrounding the lake, carrying a weight that penetrated Carl's chest and left him frozen in place, straining to locate the source in the fog-laden shadows along the shoreline. He felt a presence there, vast and deliberate, eyes upon him, though he could not see them. The cold certainty of being observed pressed against his awareness. Every instinct screamed that the creature responsible was intelligent, capable of assessment and strategy, and far larger than any known predator in the area. Carl moved cautiously along the sand, scanning the edges of the tree line and rocks as the morning light slowly revealed the contours of the lake, while the fog hovered low over the surface. The boat remained a twisted wreck, aluminum bent in unnatural angles, the fire pit disturbed but intact, and the tackle stacked with precision that suggested more than curiosity. The footprints were the most telling sign, deep impressions, spaced with careful consideration, leading toward the forest and then vanishing without warning. The arcs of the tracks implied an observer circling the campsite, testing the boundaries of Carl's space, moving in a slow, deliberate rhythm designed to assert presence and authority without engaging directly. No wind had passed through that night, no storm had struck, and no human could have moved with such strength and precision in the pre-dawn darkness without leaving more evidence. Carl felt a chill creep along his spine as the enormity of what he was witnessing settled in. The lake itself seemed to pulse with silence and intent, the water reflecting shapes that were not there, and the trees along the edge appeared to shift slightly, as though aware of him, as though watching his every move with deliberate calculation. His mind raced with possibilities, each rational explanation falling away under the weight of evidence and instinct. The presence he felt was colossal, intelligent, and uncomfortably aware of him, a silent judge of his intrusion upon its domain. Despite his years of solitary trips, Carl recognized the danger immediately. The growl returned, softer this time but more resonant, vibrating through the sand beneath his feet and the water lapping gently against the rocks. He dared not move closer to the tree line or inspect the prints further, understanding that this was a predator both patient and calculating, capable of observing and testing without immediate aggression, yet powerful enough to destroy objects and intimidate a human with ease. Every instinct told him to leave, to retreat before curiosity or bravado could place him in harm's way. By the time the first rays of the sun breached the horizon, illuminating the lake with faint gold and pink, Carl had abandoned his campsite entirely. He left the area quickly, packing only what he could carry, aware that any delay might provoke a return or closer attention from the unseen presence. The footprints and the carefully stacked gear remained behind, silent testimony to the intelligence, size, and deliberate action of whatever had visited him. The water was calm again, the mist lifting, yet the impression of being observed lingered like a weight across the hills and shoreline. Later, as Carl recounted the events to locals, few spoke openly of what he described. Bears were suggested, humans playing pranks, or natural causes, yet none of these explanations fit the scene or the evidence. The footprints were enormous, the stacking deliberate, and the growls resonated in a pattern that defied animal behavior. Carl knew what he had felt, seen, and heard. A colossal intelligence moving silently, capable of observation and strategy, testing him in his own domain. The memory remained vivid, unshakable, a reminder that the waters and forests of Okanagan Lake held more than natural life, a presence that could watch, calculate, and judge those who ventured too close.